Welcome to the October 2015 Team Studio and TLCC webinar. Thank you for joining us. As always, I'd like to introduce my co-host and today's speaker, Howard Greenberg from TLCC, who will be presenting Move Your XPages applications to the fast lane. My name is Courtney. I'm the Marketing Associate at Team Studio and your co-host today. Before we start talking about today's topic, I'll be taking a few moments to tell those of you who are new to our webinar series who we are and what we do at Team Studio. I'll then be passing the controls to Howard Greenberg at TLCC so he can give an intro, and then we'll dive into today's topic. To get us started, I'm going to cover just a few administrative points. The first being to protect your privacy, the attendee list is not public. Also, all attendees are muted during this session, so you can participate by typing your questions for Howard inside the question section on your GoToWebinar window. We're doing Q&A at the end of this session, but you're welcome to ask your question at any point in the question section, and we'll get to it once the formal presentation has ended. This session is being recorded, and the link will be sent to you in a follow-up email in just a few days. So for the intro to Team Studio, we've been delivering innovative developer tools and productivity tools to the Notes and Domino community since 1996, where we specialized in source code control, version management, and source code management. And we moved into the mobile app arena in 2010 with our mobile application platform, Unplugged. Unplugged gives you the ability to extend your IBM Notes apps out to mobile devices. It leverages the powerful technology of XPages and provides a native app experience for the user. And these apps have the capability to function when offline. Apps run very quickly, and development of apps is easier than ever. In addition to Unplugged as a platform, we provide off-the-shelf template apps like Team Studio Continuity for mobile business continuity, OneView for mobile approvals requests, and Customer View for mobile CRM. We'd be happy to arrange a demo to show you how these tools work. Just contact us directly from our website. In late last year, we launched X-Controls. This project allows developers to quickly create XPages apps by dragging and dropping custom controls into their XPages. The applications developers create will work on desktop browsers, mobile browsers, and Team Studio Unplugged. You can download this project from Team Studio's website. Learn more at teamstudio.com/solutions/xfoundations/xcontrols. Here at Team Studio, we offer services that can provide you with the resources you need to meet project deadlines. Our services, such as the Developer Assistance Program, App Upgrade Analysis, and App Usage Auditing, can help you work more efficiently with fewer errors. You can learn more also on the Team Studio website, teamstudio.com/solutions/services. For promotions and announcements from Team Studio, we're running a promo on X-Controls Business Edition. You'll be entered to win an Apple iPad mini when you demo X-Controls Business Edition. Just click on the blue and yellow banner that pops up at first on the Team Studio homepage for more info on this offer. And lastly, in a few weeks on November 3rd, Team Studio is hosting a webinar with Matt White and Rich Sharp to talk about the X-Controls. They'll answer some frequently asked questions and help make it clear how to get started using these controls. You can save your seat for this free broadcast from the Team Studio website. And now I would like to pass the presentation over to Howard so he can talk just a little bit about TLCC, and then we'll kick things off with today's topic. So over to you, Howard.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, there you are. Yeah, you were muted for a second.
Okay. Yeah, was struggling to find the unmute button. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and thanks, Courtney, for the introduction. So today I'm flying solo. My partner, Paul, has decided to take a well-deserved holiday in Paris, so if anyone sees him walking around the streets of Paris, we missed him on the webinar today. I should have posted his picture so you can be on the lookout for him. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about a presentation I gave at MWUG in August in Atlanta that talks about how to improve your XPages performance. And in doing so, we're going to learn quite a bit about XPages architecture, because understanding that is key to understanding XPages performance. Before we get started with the webinar, just a little bit about myself. I've been doing Notes in Domino for many years. I started back on the Release 3 when I left IBM after being there 12 years, and started consulting and teaching Notes in Domino at that time in 95, and then I should say 85, and in 87, Paul and I co-founded TLCC to offer training courses for Notes in Domino. We were the first providers of self-paced distance learning courses for Notes in Domino. I'm currently an IBM champion, some more on that later, and also in a previous life I was a certified public accountant, and more recently I got certified as a information systems auditor, which is kind of an interesting experience, seeing things from a different viewpoint. And in my spare time I'm also a pilot, and so going along with all the certified things, I figured I'd throw in the certified flight instructor. And if you happen to know Carl Tyler, no, I was not his flight instructor. So a little bit about TLCC. So as I mentioned, we have self-paced courses that we actually deliver using the Notes client. The courses are on XPages, Notes in Domino development, administration, and we also have a set of user courses as well, all delivered in the Notes client. And then you do demonstrations and activities in the Domino Designer or Domino Administrator, depending on the course. We have a couple free demo courses, including an Introduction to XPages course. So if you've never done anything with XPages before, wondering what it's all about, it's a nice little 2-3 hour free course that you can try. Paul and I also do mentoring, so we've been helping a number of our students kind of get up to speed on XPages, kind of bridge the gap between what you learn in our courses and applying those skills to your actual applications that you're trying to develop. And we also can do instructor-led courses, either via the web or come onto your site to teach a class. And finally, Paul and I also get involved in actual, development and consulting of XPages apps or just support for any of your existing apps or administration needs. One thing I want to mention, we had a fall sale that we've extended through the end of the month, through the 30th. So you can really save, quite a lot of money with this. So check out the link if you're looking to get some training. Now is really a great time to buy between now and the end of October. Okay, so coming up, we got a really interesting panel of experts. We have David Weedy, Jesse Gallagher, Nathan Freeman, and Mike McArroll. And the way that it's going to work in November 17th is that each one of those gentlemen, our experts, are going to do a short 5-minute presentation, just kind of warm things up. But then we're going to open the panel up to answer any of the questions you might have, as long as they're XPages related. So, in the next month, kind of think of any questions you might have. Come in, enjoy, their short presentations, and then we're going to turn things over to you guys, basically, for you to ask your questions of our panel. These guys really are the experts, and I think between the 4 of them, we probably can take care of just about any XPages question. Not to put the pressure on our panelists, but I have faith in them. So the link is there on the screen. Also, all our webinars from like 2013, I think maybe even earlier, have been recorded, and the link, there's tons of information out there. You can get that at our website too and see all our previous webinars. I mentioned the IBM Champion Program. If you're not aware of this, I mentioned this last month, but this is to recognize people who are not IBM employees but who are participate in the community, help out by presenting at user conferences, have some great blogs, or in the case of David Weedy, have a video blogs, or do webinars like this one, hint, hint. So, if there's someone you feel has helped you or some people you think have helped you, you can even nominate yourself. The links are on the slide that will be sent out. So go on. The nomination is through the end of the month. Please nominate folks who've helped you through the past year in forums or just by reading their blogs or whatever the case may be. So a little bit about asking questions. There is a chat panel that we do not use for questions, so don't use that. What we're going to do is you can ask your questions in the questions pane in the GoToWebinar interface, and then I will look at your questions at the end of the webinar and will answer those verbally. So I won't be typing in the response in the questions pane, but we will review the list of questions and go through the questions at the end of the webinar. So what we're going to talk about today, actually before we get started, let's take a poll. Let's get some information about you guys and learn about your XPages background. Courtney, if you could launch the first poll question. So just wondering, in terms of our audience, what your XPages background, and the first question is what kind of, have you done at least one XPages application that's in production? So other than just creating some testing or warning apps. And let's see, we'll give everyone a little bit of time to answer. Okay, Courtney, you can close that down now. Okay, so about 3/4 of you have done an XPages production app. So about 1/4 of you, are still in the learning process, I would assume, or maybe still working on your first production app. So that's interesting to know. Let's go ahead and ask the next poll question. And I'm sure a lot of you who have been working with XPages have heard, a lot about Java, because Java is the basis for XPages. Even if you haven't used it, under the covers, everything's still being converted to Java. So just wondering if you've used Java in your XPages development. And so our people are answering. Right now, it's maybe about 60% of you have, and the rest have not. So we're getting. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that one down, Courtney. Okay, so there's the final results. So we have, 64% of you have used Java and 36% have not. And the reason why I asked that in this webinar is because ultimately, the best performance comes when you're working with pure Java as opposed to the at functions and in server-side JavaScript. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is back in 2013, I think it was November, Ulrich Krauser and I did a session, webinar on XPages performance. And we spent a lot of time, just about all our time, talking about the things that affected XPages performance. Ulrich talked through some Java cases about building strings. I spoke, and Ulrich spoke a little bit about the architecture of XPages and how that impacts performance. So I'm going to spend the first part of this webinar talking, kind of rehashing some of that information, because something called the XPages lifecycle that you have to understand to be able to optimize your applications. Part of that also is the partial refresh, partial execution, what those are and how they impact your XPages applications and how they impact your performance. Some things we didn't really talk too much about in our previous webinar was what tools can we use to analyze performance. But then I want to spend a lot of time going through, I have 2 case studies, and take it a step-by-step of how we can analyze the performance of a specific application and how we can improve that. So, and then we should have time for questions at the end. So that's our agenda. So for more information, you might want to go back and review our previous webinar that we did, back in almost a year ago, actually almost 2 years ago. That would kind of give you a good background on some other topics on performance, as well as be a good review for some of the things I'm going to talk about. One thing I am going to assume is that you are an XPages developer. If you're just starting out, some of the things I might talk about may be a little foreign to you, but I am gearing this webinar towards an intermediate to advanced developer of XPages. So getting started, what affects XPages performance? So we can kind of sum it up by everything. In the end, XPages applications are a browser type application. So you have on your client, you got your the choice of your browser, the version, the operating system, your speed of your CPU, the speed of your hard drive, how much memory you have, all affect your client performance. Then, of course, a big thing is going to be your network performance and network latency. And then finally, on the server end, the hardware, the operating system, and then what happens in Domino all affect performance. So it's kind of a pretty broad impact, or pretty broad things that we have to consider. I'm going to focus a lot on the server, because that's really the part we can control. I mean, yes, we have some control over the network, how much money we spend for our network connection, and in the case of a corporate application, we can probably have some control over the clients, but in the end, most of us can really only kind of affect what's going on the server. What happens on the server is, the network request comes into Domino through the server hardware, server operating system. Then the HTTP task on Domino takes over, gets the request, passes it on to the XPages engine. The XPages runtime engine has to restore that XPage to memory, so it has to build what's called a component tree, which is the state of the XPage application, or the XPage in memory. And from that, the XPages engine builds the HTML, CSS, and all that other stuff that has to get sent back down to the browser. So the process of doing that is called the JSF lifecycle. We're going to talk about that a lot. And in the process of creating that HTML and CSS and going through the JSF lifecycle, it's going to have to call your backend Domino objects if that's storing that you want to the user or want the user to interact with. And so, of course, then all that HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all that stuff has to be passed back down through the HTTP task, the Domino networking software, the operating system, and through the network back to the client. A couple things that you want to be aware of for the server performance. Obviously, CPU, a hard drive, and your network speed are important. Memory is very important. XPages are very memory intensive. I have a note under operating system, use a 64-bit operating system. Hopefully none of you are using a 32-bit server operating system for a production server. The reason I say that is obviously 32 versus 64. 64 is always better, but a 32-bit operating system limits the Domino HTTP task to using only 2 GB of memory, whereas a 64-bit OS can use the full amount of memory on the, that's available. So that's probably the biggest issue using a 32-bit OS. And memory setting in your notes any setting, you can control the amount of memory used by the Java virtual machine that the Domino HTTP task uses. That's the HTTP JVM max heap size. The default is 256 megabytes. However, you can make that bigger. If you do change that, you need to use the second notes any setting that I have here, where you set that to 1 to keep the notes any setting for the memory from getting set back to the default when you upgrade your Domino, either put on a fix back or go to a new point release or a new version. Another factor is the number of threads that you can set for the HTTP task, and there's a link I put in for an article from IBM. You don't want to arbitrarily set this to be too big. That can cause performance problems, and obviously you don't want it too small. So the article from IBM kind of goes into a lot of detail. And then I also mentioned encryption, HTTPS, which provides the secure HTTP transfer. Obviously that has an impact on performance, but nowadays is kind of almost being a requirement for a lot of websites, especially dealing with any sort of personal information. One setting that is very important that not only affects performance but can affect your usage or how your XPages act is one called xsp.persistence.mode, which is set in the XSP properties file, which can be for the application or for the server. So the setting for the application will override what was set for the server. This, for the application, can also be set in the XSP properties file in Domino Designer. I think it's under the persistence tab. And there's 3 settings that you can set. So the default is keep only the current page in memory. So that's going to let the Domino HTTP task, the XPages engine, will load up the current page the user is working with in memory, and will put all the other pages they were working with back out to disk. So then if the user requests those pages again, it has to load those pages back in from the disk. The other option is keep pages in memory. And if you keep pages in memory, then it just keeps all the pages the user is working with in memory until you start to run out of memory, which could lead to memory issues. And being that users tend to not necessarily go back to a page, it may not make sense. So it's something you probably want to only use, where that user is going to be going back and forth between a couple of different XPages a lot. And if you do use it, you might want to keep an eye on your memory usage. The default is the setting IBM recommends, so keep only the current page in memory. And that is called file X when you're actually looking at the text representation of the XSP properties file. So something you want to keep in mind, if you have it set to keep pages on disk, you might want to change back to the IBM default of keep only the current page in memory. So the current page the user is working with will be in memory and will be much quicker. Another setting that is very useful is the JavaScript CSS aggregation. The idea is that if you choose this setting, it will group together and build and try to optimize or minimize the number of JavaScript files and CSS files that get sent down to the browser. So let's actually go look at this one and look at a example of how this works. Okay, so if we have in our XSP properties file in the persistence tab, so I have the setting runtime, use runtime optimize JavaScript and CSS resources checked on. I'm going to turn that off and save it, and I'm going to go to my application. Where's my browser? Okay, so here's the an application, and log in. Okay, so let me go to Firebug, and we'll go to the net pile, and let me panel. Let me reload this page. And let me then, let's make this a little smaller. Okay, so let me then do a Control F5 to reload it all. That's actually what I should have done. Okay, so now if you look, you see that we have a whole bunch of JavaScript and CSS files got loaded as part of loading up this XPage. In a way, and the total was 39 requests. So we had 39 GET requests to load not only our XPage, but also all the JavaScript and CSS files that are needed to make this XPage operate. So let's go back to Designer, and let's turn this setting on and save it. I'll go back to my browser, and I'll do a Control F5. Notice now we're only loading 15 requests, okay? And what it did was combine as many of these files as it can into one. Okay, so that obviously is going to be a lot faster by having a lot less requests that have to be made to the server, a lot less files that the browser has to deal with. The only downfall is that when you're trying to debug something, your JavaScript and CSS is kind of grouped in with these other files. So it might be a little harder to figure out. Let's say if you're trying to figure out why does something look this way, and you go into Firebug and it says it's in this file that you've never heard of, that's because it kind of got aggregated with some other things. And so what you want to do is turn the setting off, and then you can see exactly the name of the CSS file that that particular style was applied from. And you can go in and make your updates and changes, and then just remember to come back and turn the setting back on when you're ready to move into production. But when you're debugging and creating your app, you might want to leave the setting off just to make it easier. Okay, so that's that setting there. So what we're going to do is talk for the rest of the session. We're really going to talk about the XPages lifecycle, because as developers, this is really where we have the most control over the performance of our application. Because when the user is working with an XPage, you're, let's say, clicking a button in an XPage, there's some client-side JavaScript will run, but eventually that gets submitted to the server, and as I said, it goes through the Domino HTTP task, gets to the XPages engine, where it kicks off the JSF lifecycle, which goes through a number of steps that are involved in figuring out what has to get sent back to the client. And then that displays in the browser. So when we first do a request, and now keep in mind this is talking about a post. So when we first get an XPage, that's going to use a GET request, okay, which is pretty simple. We'll talk about that next. But when the user then interacts with that XPage and clicks a button to submit that XPage back to the server, it's going to go through this JSF lifecycle for a post request. And the first thing that's going to happen, if you remember I talked about those memory settings, is that if the XPage is not already in memory, it has to bring the XPage into memory and then rebuild the component tree. The component tree are all the things on the XPage. All your input controls and your labels and all that stuff is part of the component tree. So that's what happens in the restore view phase. So these are all called phases. The next phase is that we have a number of data that the user put into the various editable controls, your edit box, your combo box, all those things. The user put data into those, and we have to apply that data to the controls in the component tree. So we got to take the data the user put into a particular input control and move that over to the control in the component tree. The next thing that has to happen is we have to validate and convert the data. So validations, that's kind of obvious. You got to go through all the validations that you had set up. If validation fails, it moves on to the render response phase and skips the next phases. And then conversion. So if you had a, let's say the user entered a number in a field that was, in the end, we want to store it in our Domino document as a number, that has to get converted into a number, and in the process of getting converted, the user might have put in something that can't be converted to a number, in which case conversion will fail, and again, it goes to the last phase to render the response to the user. Assuming the validation conversion worked, then we want to move the values to our data sources. In this case, many times our data source is our Domino document. So the data gets moved to the Domino document that's in memory. And then we do what's called the invoke application phase. So these are all the events on the XPage, like the on-click event or on-change event or on-client load. All the events on the XPage get invoked in this fifth phase, the invoke application phase. And finally, but definitely probably the most important, is that the render response phase is where all the controls get converted to HTML, and the XPages engine figures out what HTML, JavaScript, CSS does it have to send back down to the browser. And here we also have the before render response and the after render response. So if you ever wondered what those events are on the XPage, before render response happens right before this phase gets kicked off. After render response is after everything gets converted to HTML. Then the event after render response happens. And then it sends all the HTML stuff back to the browser. Okay, so let's look at a application, kind of see how this works. When we do an initial load, that's called a GET request, right? So I mentioned that. And let's close this down. So let's look at this application here that we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes. So obviously I have Mark's great XPages debug toolbar on here. We're going to use that to see what's going on. But I have a label on the XPage. The label is computed, and in the formula, I'm printing out using the debug toolbar the text label property for ID, and I'm getting the ID for this label. And then we're printing that out to the debug toolbar, but the label itself is going to say label 1. Then we have a rendered property. Okay, so we're always going to return true for the rendered property, but more importantly is that when this calculation happens, we are going to output to the debug toolbar. Okay, so that's the label. Then we have a edit box or input text control. Again, we have a rendered property that's going to output to the debug toolbar, and we also have a as soon as that little data source required goes away, we have a default value. So it's returning a default value for this edit box, again outputting to the debug toolbar. Combo box label, again the label has a rendered property, and then in our combo box itself, again we got a rendered property here, but we also are computing the values that appear in the combo box, east, west, north, and south, but again outputting to the debug toolbar. So I think you're getting the hint that whenever any sort of computation happens on this XPage, we're going to output to the debug toolbar. Then we have two computed fields. Again, they have a rendered property, but they also display the current time, date and time, and of course output to the debug toolbar. So we got two of those. And then we have our submit button. Our submit button is going to output to the debug toolbar, but also it's going to do a full update. Okay? So when I initially load this in my browser, and let's turn off our Firebug. Okay, so if we go to our debug toolbar, you see that as we look to see what happened, it did all the rendered properties for the labels and the combo box, and it did the values property for the combo box. It did it twice. And of course it did our values property, or value property, for our computed field 1 and 2. So all that kind of makes sense. So the next thing we're going to do is interact with this Let me shut this down. So we're going to interact with this XPage as a user and choose some values. Then I'm going to submit it. So let's take the, going back to our design, I'm going to take a little poll here. This is a little quiz. We're going to test you guys. So on this combo box, I had a rendered property. How many times do you think this formula, let me show you the formula, is going to output to the debug toolbar? In other words, how many times will this formula run when I submit this XPage? And so let me start up the poll here. And so I gave you some ranges here. So if you don't know, just take a guess. Okay, use your best judgment here. And we'll see what happens. So remember, we had all our different phases. So people are still voting. I'll give it another little bit. Get your votes in. Your vote counts. Okay, I think we're kind of stabilized in our, let's see if I know how to do this. Hopefully I got this right. Oh, I got to share it. Okay. All right, so let me share the results to everybody. All right, so half of you said 1 to 3 times. Another 34% of you said 4 to 6. 4% said 7 to 9. And 13% of you said more than 9. All right, let's figure out the answer. So let's go back. I'll first show you in the browser. I'll submit this page. Before I submit it, I'm going to go to the debug toolbar. And we actually have a little option here, Mark Bluesink put in, to enable the lifecycle debugging. I'm going to turn that on, and you'll see what it does in a minute. And I'm going to submit this. And I'm going to then open up our debug toolbar, and we'll come down to the bottom. So you see that by checking that enable the lifecycle on in our debug toolbar, it actually identifies what phase we're in. So let's look. Phase 1, nothing happened. Phase 2, our rendered property for our combo box, 2 times there. Then we move on to phase 3, which is our validation. Rendered property for our combo box, 2 times there. So we're up to 4. Then we go to phase 4, where we apply the data. 2 more, we're up to 6. Then finally, the render response phase. There's our combo box rendered property, 1 more time there. We're up to 7. So 7 was the correct answer. So over 75% of you didn't think it would run that many times. So hopefully right now, a light bulb just went off and said, why am I doing all these complicated things in my rendered formula? And seeing it here, hopefully, hold on, let me see if we're, I think you guys are seeing the chart now. Okay, so seeing what happened overall for that one little XPage application, we had 39 separate calls in server-side JavaScript between our rendered properties, our computing the values for the combo box, our default value, and obviously the rendered is happening multiple times throughout this JSF lifecycle. Okay, so you know that is a lot of computations going on. So it's something, you know, that you definitely have to keep in mind, and why understanding this life cycle is so important. So what can we do about this? Well, the first thing we can do, and when we initially start developing our applications, we throw our server-side JavaScript into our little formula editors. And if it works, that's great. That's all we, you know, think about. But there's a little setting on top of where you put in the formula. Compute dynamically is the default. What that means is this formula, every time the XPage gets submitted, this formula will get calculated multiple, and as we saw, multiple times. Obviously, many times it has to get recomputed, because when the user interacts with the XPage and changes some values, enters some values, whatever, and submits it, and then you want to, you know, send back the same XPage, but maybe they choose a department, and then once they choose a department, you want them to then select a person's name from that department. So obviously something's got to be computed dynamically. But if you stop and think about it, a lot of things that you have on your XPage only has to happen when the XPage loads and never has to get recomputed. So you can check off compute on page load. What that means in your source code is that the little pound sign in front of your code will change to a $sign. And that means that it will only happen on page load, only happen one time when the page is first loaded, and will never get recalculated again. Every time you write some formula, think about what has to happen with this formula. Try to use compute on page load wherever you can. And hopefully the reason why was pretty obvious from the last slide. You don't want all these things getting recomputed in your JSF lifecycle, especially if it's something complicated, like doing a lookup somewhere. Okay, so let's actually look at this. Let me, before I show you the results, let's look at how this can impact everything. So if I have the same application, only this time I took all the rendereds. Okay, the only thing I changed was the rendereds, and I made these compute on page load. So you see that compute on page load for all the rendereds, because what we were doing didn't have to be a dynamic. And I believe I also made the combo box values compute on page load. So I only changed the rendered and the combo box values to be computed on page load. So let's go see what happens when we run this. Okay, so this is, let me hide this. Let me again interact with the XPage. Okay, submit it and look at our messages here. So notice, oops, let me come back to that. Okay, so notice when I submitted it, it did a lot less stuff. It did the validation for input text 1, it did our default value property, did the on-click event for the button, and in the render response, it did the computed field 1 and 2 value and the label for label 1. Seeing that on the chart, we only did 6 server-side JavaScript calls, so I saved 33 by getting rid of changing all those rendereds. I didn't get rid of them, I just changed them to compute on page load only. So pretty significant savings just by changing about 3, controls to compute on page load. So something to keep in mind. Again, I'll reiterate this point. Whenever you write a formula, think, can this be computed just on page load? If it can, choose that option, okay? All right. But obviously that doesn't work all the time. So, that's the whole point of in many, having the rendered property is that lots of times we want to dynamically show and hide things. Obviously we did that back in Notes client days with the hide when, as well as in, traditional Domino web development. So how can we still, make this better? Well, think about what you're putting into the rendered properties. And I pick on the rendered because we saw how bad that is in terms of getting computed multiple times. Don't do any heavy calculation in your rendered property. Try to do it somewhere else, like in the button. When the user clicks the button, figure out what do I want to show next and put that into a scope variable. And then in your rendered property, just have the scope variable, true or false. Show this control or not, or that's try to always move your calculations, especially ones that involve looking up data or any sort of heavy computation, to somewhere else outside of the rendered, and in the rendered just have a scope variable. Another option is the data context. And what data context are, I don't know how many people use them. Personally, I don't use them that much. But what a data context is, let me see if I had an example. Yes, I did. Okay, so a data context is a way to, it's sort of like a scope variable, but we apply it to the XPage level or to a panel. So in my case here, in this example, I have in the XPage properties, the easiest way to see these is under all properties. There's a line for data context. And if you create one just by putting your cursor over and choosing the plus sign. Then you can set a value and a var. The var is the name we're going to use to reference it, and the value is what we're going to show for that value. And data context can be computed dynamically or compute on page load. If we choose to compute them dynamically, let me go ahead and show you this. So let me clear the messages here and hide that. Okay, so if I put in some values and click OK and look at our messages, notice that we had the data context happened 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in the course of that life cycle. So, you know, having a data context that computes dynamically is basically not very good. And one thing I didn't show you is where do we use this. So we set the data context, and then in our rendered property, I just referred to the data context here to figure out if we should show that particular control or not. So kind of like a scope variable. But instead of having a scope variable, this is something applied to the XPage level, or you can apply it to a panel level within your XPage. So you have to be careful with data contexts when you set them to compute dynamically, because I said I think 6 times, but I think we just showed it was more than that, because they get recalculated multiple times, even when you choose partial execution, which we'll talk about later. And even if you're not using them. So what you want to do is, if you're going to use data context, compute them on page load. And then if you have to change the value in the data context, Paul Withers has written a blog entry on how you can then go in and access the data context value and set it via your code. So you put the code that Paul suggested in your button to change the data context value. And then your data context itself, you just say compute on page load to do the initial computation, kind of like a default value, and then you just change it whenever you need to change it with Paul Withers' way of doing it, as opposed to setting the data context dynamically. Don't ever do that. And so a lot of you are probably saying, but I already do that in my application. Well, it's programmer job longevity, I guess you can call it. Go back to your boss. Now we got to go back and change my app. Okay, so let's talk about partial refresh, partial execution. I find these are really misunderstood. They do very, very different things, even though they both say partial. Partial update is what it's called in the Domino interface. Everyone, I think, calls it partial refresh. So those can be used interchangeably. Partial execution is in Domino 9, is fully in the Domino Designer interface as well. So what these are, partial refresh will compute the entire XPage, but then when we get to the render response phase, it's only going to send back to the browser what's in the part of the XPage that we said to partially refresh. So in the case of the picture here, we said only partially refresh panel 1. So it's only going to do the render response for panel 1, because that's all it's going to send back to the browser. However, everything else in the other phases of the JSF lifecycle will get computed. Okay, so the only difference is in the render response. That's partial refresh. Partial execution is kind of like the opposite. That's going to only calculate what's in the area that we specified, but in the render response, it will do the entire X page and send back the entire X page. So partial execution affects the Java server faces lifecycle phases 1 through 5. Partial refresh will only really affect the render response or the last phase, phase 6. And we'll see that very explicitly in a moment. So let's see, let me switch to Designer. Okay, so first let's look at partial refresh. Okay, so I have the same X page here that we've been looking at, except I've wrapped a panel around the computed field 2. Okay, and I put that panel in yellow, so it's pretty obvious that you can see that's the partial refresh area. In the button, I then said that when we submit this, go to the events, that we want to do a partial update or partial refresh on panel 1. Panel 1 is the panel in yellow. So if we load this up in our browser, hold on, let me actually get the one that has the debug toolbar. Okay, I'll load this up in my browser. Let me clear the messages, hide this, put in some changes. Okay, so notice that the time for computed field 1 is 11:22:00. In the partial refresh panel, it's the same time. When I click the submit button, notice the time only changes for what's in our partial refresh panel. That makes sense, right? You know, that's the whole idea. And if we look at our JSF lifecycle, though, notice how all the stuff was still done for all the other fields. Our input text 1, our computed field 1, combo box. So we went through everything, but the render response phase only did what was in that partial refresh area, that panel 1. So looking at it in our chart, we only saved calls or time or whatever you want to call it in the render response phase. We still did everything else. Okay, so that's good. I mean, you know, partial refresh is great. It's something you always want to consider. How can I use it? But keep in mind, it's not going to save you from computing the entire X page. The entire X page still gets computed. And the server is only sending back what's in that partial refresh area. That's less, you know, network overhead. And the other benefit is your users are going to like having just part of the X page refresh rather than the whole, you know, browser window change. Only part of the browser is going to change. It's going to be a much nicer user interface. So remember, anything outside of the partial refresh area, like computed fields, remember computed fields only get computed in the render response phase. So if you have computed fields outside of the partial refresh area, those won't change. So you want to be careful when you turn this on for something that, you know, is already done. Don't go back to your production app and turn partial refresh on for everything without, you know, carefully testing it and making sure it's not going to impact everything. You also can only specify one area to partially refresh, and I do have a link from Tim Tripconi, who continues to, you know, even after his passing, provide all these great tidbits in all the blogs that he wrote. And so that will go through how you can refresh more than one partial refresh panel. So something, you know, sometimes you might need to refresh, you know, the first part of an X page, but then later down you want to also partially refresh something else, and they're not contiguous. So that tip will show you how you can refresh more than one partial refresh area. Okay, so the next thing is partial execution. So let's look at partial execution. Okay, again, same setup. I got a panel. I'm going to partially execute it. This time I'm going to do a full update, so I'm not choosing any partial refresh options, but I'm going to choose a partial execution option. And the element we selected is panel 1. If you're still using Designer 8.5, you won't have this setting. You actually got to go into source code and set these settings here. You can set the partial execution, but you can't specify the area to partially execute, which is called exec ID, and you have to set it to panel 1. If you're using Designer 8.5, you need to upgrade. You know, let's be clear. You know, sorry to be so blunt, but there's so many changes from 8.5 to 9, and it's not just little nice things like this in Designer. But anyway, I'll get off my soapbox and say, oh, the other thing I want to mention is that when you use partial execution, this actually came up on Stack Overflow, I think last week. Whatever's kicking off the execution has to be inside your partial execution panel. So if you stop and think about it, that makes sense. You know, if you're saying only execute what's in this yellow area, whatever kicks off that partial execution has to get executed too to kick off that execution. So, you know, you got to put whatever, you know, if it's an on-click event in a button, an on-change event, that has to be inside the panel that's getting partially executed. Okay, so let's go try this out, and let's clear our messages and do the same thing. And I want you to carefully note that I'm changing these values and note the times. Let's see what changes now. Okay, so this is very important. So we said only execute what's inside this area, and notice that our time changed in the partial execution area. Kind of expect that, but that my values I set in the input box and the combo box got reset to the default. So you're probably saying, well, I don't want that to happen. But if you think of why that happened, we only did phases 1 through 5 for that partial execution area. So we never did the update model values. The data the user entered in those input text 1 and the combo box never got applied to the components that underlie them and to our dominant document eventually. So they got reset to the default values in the render response because they never, you know, got the new values. The entire render response ran, and it did the default value for input text 1, and it did the combo box 1 things, which reset everything back to the default. So obviously you got to be careful with that. And yes, we did save, you know, a lot of these rendered properties. So what makes sense here? First of all, just, you know, as you see, we did save a lot of processing time. And as I mentioned, that whatever kicks off the partial execution has to be inside the partial execution area. Editable values outside of the partial execution area don't get submitted and they don't get updated. They get reset to their default values. So clearly, you're going to be very careful when you apply this to existing applications. And I mentioned before that in 8.5 you can do this stuff, but only 9.0 has the user interface in Designer if you're not using the source pane. So let me come back to the best of both worlds. So if we combine those two, so I have the same panel, same XPage. This time when I submit it, I do a partial refresh of what's in the yellow panel, and I do a partial execution of what's in the yellow panel. Both are the same, you know, panel 1. When we submit this, and notice that now only everything in the yellow panel changes. Okay, let's see where we're at. So you see that we saved, we only went through, we didn't execute everything. We only executed what was in the yellow panel. But then in the render response, because we only did the render response for what was in the partial refresh panel, it didn't reset our values. So it kept those all the same. And then at some point in time later, the user could have another button that submits the entire XPage, and those values in the input text 1 and the combo box would eventually get submitted. But at this point, we were just trying to update part of the XPage. Okay, the loaded property, that's going to only load a control. This happens in the initial phase 1. So if we choose the loaded property, that's great for performance because it never brings that control into the component tree. So the control is never created. The downside is we can never go back and say, no, I changed my mind, I want to load it. This only happens when the XPage is loaded. So if you know your control is never going to be used on that XPage at that particular use of it, then the loaded property is really a great way to save memory, save performance, help performance. So we talked a lot about the rendered property. Not all the properties are like that, like the CSS style and style class only get computed in the render response phase. We've shown you how the rendered property is bad and how partial refresh, partial execution combined can be very helpful. Okay, some tools we can use to help out in our performance. Print statements are great, especially if you have access to the server console. If you can show the server console as you're running your XPage, put in print statements, you can see when things are getting executed in your different events. Oh, if you don't have access to the server console, use a debug toolbar like I'm using. I got a link there to get that. That's something that should be on everyone's list of tools that they use for XPages development. In terms of monitoring your performance, your server OS has tools, Windows has tools to monitor CPU, memory, networking. Firebug and the equivalent in Chrome, or God forbid, Internet Explorer, are all very useful. If you're doing XPages in the Notes client, there's a Firebug Lite in the extension library that lets you use the Firebug or most of the functionality of Firebug in the Notes client. And you can also do your JavaScript debugging if you want to kind of analyze performance. The one I want to spend a little bit of time on is the XPages toolbox. This can run on your server if you're using Xpink, the Notes client. What you got to do is install a Notes database. You got to install a jar file to the JVM directory. You got to modify the security policy. You got to modify the Notes INI. Everything's documented in the documentation, and I'll show you what this does in a moment. But this is a really good tool for performance measurement. What it does is, let me just show you what it does. So let's say I have, let me close some of these windows. Okay, so here's the XPages toolbox. Log in. Okay, so there's the XPages toolbox. So let's say there's a couple of tabs. CPU profiler will measure your performance in terms of the CPU time, or what's called the wall time. The wall time would be more expansive than just what the CPU is doing. That would be kind of the total time. We'll see that work in a second. The backend profiler will measure the calls to your backend Domino objects and what classes were used to interact with those backend Domino objects. The runtime monitoring, we can take a snapshot. That will show us how much memory is in use, how much is free, and your maximum memory that was set. You can do session dumps. If you generate a JVM heap dump, you need a special tool to analyze that. You can dump information in XML format. I don't necessarily find these as useful, but then I'm not really, up on some of this stuff as I should be. Periodic snapshots will just take snapshots every so many seconds, and threads will show you all the threads. Let's concentrate on the first two tabs. And so I have an application here that we're going to talk about more in a moment, but users are saying this is slow. So they're saying when I choose, a person here and click update, it takes too long. So what I can do is say, oh, let's see what's going on. I can go over and say, start the wall timer. Actually, let me stop it. Let me reset it. Make sure we got a clean slate. Okay, so let me start the wall timer, go back to my application, do something, click update. That's the part they said was slow. I could do some other things if I wanted to, but I'm going to come back and stop the profiler. Then it's going to show me what exactly it did. So let's show more entries here to make sure we showed everything. So this is when I interacted with that X page, and a lot of these have 0, so I can actually just choose this hierarchical dominators to kind of get rid of some of those 0 entries. So you see that this X page took 1,739 milliseconds, and these are all the things it did. So like, for example, this JavaScript expression took 249 milliseconds. Here's all the stuff that was in it, right? And here's the average time, the maximum time, and it got executed 42 times. 42 happens to be the number of documents in my repeat on my app. And then we can even drill down to a specific app function that it was calling. So calling this @db lookup 42 times took 112 milliseconds. So that looks like we might have a problem there. That was pretty slow. So let's look at what it's doing interacting with the domino object. So I'll start the profiler, go back to my application, go to change it again, go back to my XPages toolbox and stop the profiler. And it creates this document here that has a link. And so I see that working with the backend objects, it took 1,438 milliseconds. These are all the calls it made. So evaluate is something that's used when you use the @. functions. It doesn't show the actual @ function, but those @ functions use the evaluate. So you see it spent a lot of time doing @ functions. And it did a lot of get all entries by key, because again, I have a repeat. I'm repeating through a view in that application. So you see where the bottlenecks were. Looks like our something in our @ functions is pretty slow. So that's the XPages toolbox. And this is, what we talked about. So I mentioned @ functions. I'll just kind of throw this out here. @db lookup is a lot slower than the server-side JavaScript equivalent. Stop using @db lookup. Just write the 2 lines of server-side JavaScript, or 3 or 4 lines, or whatever it takes, and your apps will run quicker without doing anything else. Okay, so that's my 2 seconds word of advice, and I want to move on because I kind of talked a little longer than I thought up to now. So we have an application, and let's look at this application in Designer, because this is the one I showed you before that I said the users were saying were slow. So in this application, I have a repeat, and the repeat repeats over a view. And the repeat's embedded in a table, so you can't see it. Here it is, except in the outline. Let me get to it. Okay, so I have a repeat that goes through a view data source. And the view data source is actually in a different database. So I have a database called customers, and I have this view. The repeat's going to repeat over this view. Okay, so first of all, we let them pick a user. And this is just kind of, I didn't want to log in and log out in the demo. This is kind of simulating different users who are using this app. And so we're picking a user, and in my combo box, actually, if you look at the code, first, like all good programmers, I didn't hard code in my customer database location. Instead, I have a view in my database called config view. And in this config view, I have my two databases, and I have the location of those databases. So in my app, in many places, I'm doing a lookup to get the location of the customer database. Okay? So that's in my combo box. Once I get the customer database, in this case, I was going to the user info view to get a list of the users who use this application. So I used that config view in many places. In my repeat, some of the fields I'm repeating are in the view. So in this case, the customer information is in the view. So we can just refer to it by the row data, the repeat variable, to get the customer information. However, some of the information, like the address, was not in the view. So I actually had to go to my repeat variable, get the underlying notes document, and get the address out of the document. So we had to open up the document to get that. The city was in the view, the state was not, so I had to do the same thing. The region was not in the view, so again, I had to get that from the document. The sales rep, in the customers by name view, we only have the region, but we want to display the name of the sales rep who handles that region. That's in a different view. So we had to do a lookup into that sales rep view and pass in the name of the region. Again, I'm using my config view to get the location of the customer database. And then finally, the sales. So the sales are in a different database, and I am going to the sales database, getting all the sales orders by customer, and looking up all the sales for that customer and looping through and getting a total of all the sales. But I only want to display the sales if the user is in a certain role in my user info view. So if they are in the user view, I don't want to show the sales numbers. They're not supposed to see the sales for that customer or any customers. But if they're in a different role, like a manager or a salesperson, then they can see the sales. So showing you the app, you kind of saw it already, but just show it to you again. So when they are in the user role, like user one, it's just a user role, they don't see the sales. But when they're in a manager role, like a manager person, they would see the sales. So that's my app, and it's kind of slow, as we saw. It was almost 2,000 milliseconds. So how can we fix this? So let's first, I'm going to go through a number of scenarios on how to make this faster. The first scenario is I had a configuration view, and I was doing a lookup into configuration view whenever I had to figure out where my customer database was or my sales database. So what I did was create an application scope variable. So in the before page load event, if this application scope variable is not is null, in other words, not initialized, we're going to go through and create a Java map. Now, a Java map lets you store a key and then retrieve items by the key. So before I go through that part, just look on the very bottom of the slide. And so to use this, I say application scope. We have a variable stored in there called config map. The type of variable it is a Java hash map. So we can pass in a key using the get method, and this will return the value that's stored in that key for the cusDB. In this case, the location of the customer database. So what I did was go to this view and just loop through the view and get everything in the view and put from the first column in the view, that's the key name, and the second column is where the value is. So we can do this for all sorts of configuration settings, you know, locations of databases and stuff like that, you know. So this is a good way. DB lookup, every time we want to get this information, we're going to just pull it out of memory. Remember, any scope variable just pulls out of memory. So using this in place of all the places that I had a DB lookup to the config view, so basically I'm storing in memory all those locations. You notice that it saved a significant amount of time. The time is the back end, if you remember the, going back to my XPages toolbox, the time is this time here, how much time it took in the back end time. The CPU time was the total time, which is this time here. So that's what the CPU time is, and that's what the time is here. And the calls are the number of calls we made to our back-end Domino objects. So you see that that had a pretty significant reduction in calls to the back-end Domino objects and time we spent calling those back-end Domino objects, as well as the total time for the application. So just by changing the couple places that I used the @db lookup to get configuration values to find out the location of my customer database or my sales database, because remember, a lot of that happened inside of the repeat, so it was repeated. I only had 42 documents in this repeat, so there's not a lot. So, just by, changing that, it had a pretty significant savings. So based on that, I kind of took it a step further. So in the application, we were over in the sales rep, we were using, figuring out the role of the user by doing a DB lookup to say, okay, pass in the name of the user. Oh, that's not the right place, sorry. I was in the sales. Oops, not there. In the sales, we had we were passing in the name of the user and getting the role of the user. So we had to do a lookup 42 times, for each member of the repeat, each row in the repeat, to figure out, is the user someone who should be able to see the sales data or not? So instead, again in the before page load event, we put a user map variable in application scope. And we went to the user info view, and again, I read in all the users in that view and put the name of the user in column that was in column 1 of the view as the key in our user map, and then their actual role, if they're a manager, a salesperson, or a user, in the second value. So we're avoiding that need to do the lookup and showing you that in page. That's here. Okay, so just to kind of show you where, again, where the slide has all this code, but all this code was in the before page load event. And that sets up our application scope variables, and we only want to do it if the application scope variable is null. So if application scope will remain for the beyond the life of the X page, there's a setting you can set in your XSP properties. The default's 30 minutes. So these survive for quite a long time. And then in our computed field 7, now we just have to say application scope.usermap.get, pass in the username, and that will return the role of the user. Everything's getting it out of memory. What that did was, again, reduced our number of calls to our Domino objects, significantly reduced our time it spent getting the Domino objects, as well as our CPU time. Pretty significant savings just by making those two little changes for our configuration settings and to store our user information. And again, what you're seeing in the third line takes into account what we did before with the configuration settings. In other words, everything's cumulative. The next thing I did was I didn't want to open up the notes. Some of the values in the view, like I was having to open up the notes document to get the address and the state. And instead, I just created a new view that had those missing columns. So in our X page, we can just refer to that in our using the repeat variable, and we didn't have to actually get the notes document and open it up to get the address field, we pulled the information out of the view index. Obviously, that should be a lot faster. And it was a little faster, not as much as you would think, but it was a little bit quicker. Okay, so that was something else. Again, trying to avoid having to open up notes documents, because it takes some time. Not as much time as I thought, actually. I was kind of surprised. Okay, so now we're going to get into some Java, and one of the things I was doing was getting the salesperson's name. I was doing a DB lookup. So we only have 4 salespeople in this case, but if we had 25 or 50, it'd be the same. What we want to do is, before we were doing an @DB lookup based on the region to get the salesperson's name, and we were going to a view, sales rep view, passing, saying, hey, who's the salesperson for the East region? So instead, what we're going to do is do this in Java and create it as a bean. Okay, so don't really have time to spend on how to create a bean and all that, and there's tons of stuff on the web. We've had webinars on that. So in the faces config file, we define our beans. And for now, we're actually, this iteration of what I'm doing, we just did this one that's highlighted, where I had set up a Java file called cache bean. It has application scope. So that means it's shared by all the users, and we can refer to it by calling cache bean. So in my code, in the cache bean, when we initialize this cache bean, we're going to do something called init region data. Okay, so in the init region data, we're going to get all our salespeople, and again, we're going to use a hash map, which is called region, and we're going to put in the key, will be the salesperson's name, and it's going to then return the region that salesperson administers. So when we want to use this, we just say get salesperson. We call that on our XPage, pass in the name of the key, and that gets the value that's in there for that key. So on the XPage itself, we will, this is here. So when we compute the value of the region, instead of doing a DB lookup, we're just going to call our cache bean. Everything's in memory. It will get the name of the salesperson for the region we passed in. So let's see what that did by changing that @DB lookup and instead pulling it all from a bean, which stores the data in memory. So notice that our number of backend domino calls didn't change that much, but our time dropped drastically and our CPU time dropped drastically. So that was a pretty significant savings there. So based on that, let's now say the other big time thing on this application is that when we compute the sales, so for every row in our repeat, that's 42 times in this case, we are going to a different database, getting these sales, all the sales for that customer, looping through and getting the total for all those. So that is a little bit time consuming, obviously, to have to, for each row in the repeat, look up all the sales orders for a customer and total them up. So why don't we do that in Java? So again, we go to our faces config. I created another bean. This one has a different scope. Obviously, sales orders are hopefully coming in every minute or every few minutes. So we said, make this one bean be a view scope. View scope means every time we open up the XPage, it gets recomputed. And our bean is in the sales lookup Java file. So what happens is when we initially load this, we go through and the sales orders by customers. Again, we use a map and we figure out the customer name and we figure out the total for them. And actually here I also was kind of a little smart, just kind of going back on some domino view stuff. And instead of looping through the view, I just went through and said, well, we have the sales total is categorized. So I can just get the, just go from category to category and figure out that, okay, if I'm on a category in my column 5, column 4 if you count from 0, is the sales total category, that has the total. So I can get the total for the sales for that customer, store it again in a hash map, which we call get sales, and we pass in the name of the customer. It returns the sales for that particular customer after converting it to lowercase to make sure we don't have any casing issues. So in our XPage for our sales, instead of doing all that DB lookup stuff, we just call our sales bean and pass in the name of the customer. Pretty significant. Let's see what the savings are. So you see that we drastically cut our domino backend calls and our time and our CPU time. So that worked out pretty well. Is just put everything in Java. So in other words, we have 2 beans, and we have a cache bean. I've kind of talked about some of this stuff with the region information, but I basically in the cache bean moved in the configuration settings for the database path and name. I moved in the storing of what the users can do and salesperson for each region. That's application scope, and so that will be stored and used by all users and kept in memory for a while. Then I created a customer bean. This is the job of the customer bean, is to, instead of tying the repeat to a domino view, we tie the repeat to the customer bean. And the customer bean did all the work of figuring out the sales total and getting the address and the city and the state and getting the salesperson's name. So in the customer bean, we have a bunch of get and set objects to get the customer, the region, the sales, all that stuff that we then stored in the customer table, and then we just pass that in our repeat. We just pass in the customer table to the repeat, and the repeat just goes through and gets all this information out of memory, which is in the customer bean. And then the cache bean is all our supporting configuration information. So we can get all the users, we can get the location of databases, we can see if they're a manager by passing in a username, see if they're in the sales. So let me just show you the code for the customer bean. It's called customer data. So what we're doing is storing an array list that has all our customer data, and we just go through, when we initialize this, we go through and figure everything out. Okay, I won't go through all the code. Basically, we're figuring out all the stuff that has to be in the repeat. And then on the XPage itself, we're going to, in the repeat, instead of referring to the view, the domino view, we're going to go to the customer bean customer table. So the customer bean will return the customer table, and then in the repeat we'll refer to a repeat variable is called row data, just like before. So we'll just say for the customer name, for example, we just say bind to customer, which equates to that get customer call in the customer bean. So everything, we basically took all the computation out of the XPage, moved it all to the customer bean or the cache bean. So there's really no lookups on here at all. If we look at the source code, there's no lookups. Everything's just bound to something in either the customer bean or the cache bean. Okay, so if we want to get, for like a combo box, we want to figure out what users to show, we call the cache bean.getAllUsers. And the savings here is pretty significant. basically, when we're running the XPage, doing a request scope means the customer being gets recomputed every time the user, the XPage gets refreshed. Request scopes basically don't have any life at all. So those are always getting computed. So the values will always be fresh. That's still pretty fast. But then if I make the XPage a view scope, so it gets computed when the XPage first loads, and then as the user is changing the user information, and we're changing what gets displayed, basically everything's happening out of memory. There's no back-end domino calls at all, and that's, you know, CPU time's pretty low. So we pretty significantly reduced our time spent computing the XPage. So that's one case study. I don't really have time for the other one. That's just showing it graphically. But basically, I'll let you look at this on your own in the slides and in the. I'll go through the slides, but I won't go through the demo. Basically, we did a difference between partial refresh and partial execution, and doing them both together. And I'll show you the app just so you can see how that works. The app basically said it was the same scenario as before. Let's see, I might not have my right username here. Oh yeah, don't have the right password. Is it the different server I normally use? Oh, well, anyway. All right, I guess, oh, I see the problem. The preview snuck in the IP address instead of my name. Okay, so it's basically the same as before, but then we added some functionality where you can select a region and it shows the sales for that region. So what we did was say only partially refresh, partially execute this little area in the top right corner, because when they change regions, we don't need to recompute what's in the repeat and stuff at the bottom. We only got to recompute the sales here and figure out what were the sales for that region. So doing partial refresh, partial execution together prevented all this other stuff in the XPage from running and was a lot quicker. So just selectively thinking what really has to change on this XPage as the user interacts with it can give you a pretty significant performance savings. So hopefully give you some things to think about when you're developing and some tools to use to go through your applications. This is that video that I mentioned before that George Krauser and I did back in October 2013. The YouTube and the slides. Paul Withers has written some great stuff, and I got some links there. And if you want to dive more into the JSF lifecycle, Tony McGuckin from IBM has an XPages masterclass. There's 4 videos in sample applications. And last on here, it's not about XPages, but it's about the Java server faces lifecycle. So that's a good background if you really want to get technical and understand more of what's going on. Okay, got time for, I'll take a few questions. I'm sorry I went over. It's probably in MW Lugged, I skipped some of the stuff I talked about, like on data context, and I probably should have skipped it today, but hopefully you got some good information from that. So questions are in the GoToMeeting panel. I'll go look at those now. And while I'm looking at those, you can look at the some upcoming events and some things to keep in mind. I know Andrew Modgerman in the Swiss Notes user group in Zurich, I think it is a great session planned if anyone's in that area. And let me see if I can find my questions panel. It seems to have disappeared.